In December, when I was doing my Advent series, I used a passage when I was talking about joy, and as I was reading through that passage, I felt like there was so much in that passage that could be addressed and looked into. So that's what I want to do today is go back to this passage and look at all the examples that we can take from it. So the passage is Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. It says, "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life." So you can see in this passage there's a progression taking place. And it begins with that first phrase of doing everything without grumbling or arguing. Now, if you have someone who is grumbling all the time, they're complaining, they're arguing with other people, that's reflective of a condition of their heart where they just have a bad attitude. They're always looking on the negative side of things. They're concerned with how things affect them rather than how things affect other people. And it really is just this bad attitude that people have. And so this passage is telling us that instead of having that kind of negative, bad attitude, to instead have a godly type of attitude. Because God, in his characteristic, he's a loving God, and he fills us with joy. And if you're full of love and joy, then you're not going to be walking around complaining about things and arguing with people all the time. And we see that when we have this new attitude away from the grumbling and arguing, this new attitude, this of a godly attitude, that there's this progression of things that happen that is super cool. So it says that, do everything without grumbling and arguing so that you may become blameless and pure. Blameless and pure, which I absolutely love this idea that as we build this godly attitude in our life, that somehow that leads us to having a life that is blameless and pure, which is a pretty high standard to have. I don't think any of us have a life that is completely blameless and pure. We all make mistakes, we all have failings, but this is telling us that the secret, if you will, in order to reach that blameless and pure life is to have a godly attitude. And so you might wonder, how does one thing lead to the other in that? How does having a godly attitude lead to a blameless and pure life? But it's not too hard to see the connection when you understand that all sin is rooted in selfishness. And so if we're having an attitude that matches God's attitude and a heart that matches God's heart, then we're not going to be focused on the things that we want. We aren't going to be focused on our own desires. Instead, we're going to be focused on God's love for other people. And so when we have that love for other people, that love protects us from the selfishness we can have in our life that leads to sin. Because we're more focused on other people than we are about ourselves. When we're focused on ourselves, that's what leads us to getting into trouble. That's what leads us into sin. But having a godly attitude, a godly heart of loving others protects us from that selfishness. So let me give a couple examples of this. Let's start with a really mild example of this. My wife and I love to go out and eat, and my wife's favorite thing to eat is sushi. And we have this sushi place we like to go to, and we order one sushi dinner, and it's enough to feed both of us. But the problem with this sushi dinner is that there is an odd number of pieces in this sushi dinner, which means that one of us is always going to get one more piece than the other. And I know going into it how much my wife loves sushi. And she loves it more than I do. I mean, I still enjoy it, but I know that she loves it even more. And so when we order that meal, I go into it knowing that I'm going to offer that extra piece to her. And I do that because of my love for her. And so, because of that love I have for her, that desire I have for her to be happy, I am no longer concerned with doing whatever I can do to get that last piece of sushi, which could lead to arguments between the two of us of which of us is going to get that extra piece. And so we're able to avoid the argument because my love for her and my desire to make her happy makes me go into that meal with the understanding that I'm going to let her have that extra piece. And so that's kind of an everyday example of how a love for others can protect us from selfishness. Let's use another example, kind of a more extreme example from a movie, the first Captain America movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I'm sure many of you know that scene that I'm going to reference. It's probably the best scene in the whole movie, which is the grenade scene, where they're at boot camp and the guy throws the grenade into the group of people as they're doing their, as they're exercising, doing jumping jacks, I believe. And everybody, of course, the guy yells, "Grenade!" and everybody ducks behind cover and runs away, all except for Steve Rogers, who instead of running away, throws himself on the grenade to protect the people around him. Because the amount of care he has for other people completely overrules his own selfishness, to the point that he is willing to give up his own life in order to protect the people around him, people who haven't even been treating him very well during the movie, been making fun of him, laughing at him. That doesn't matter to him. How those people treat him, it doesn't even come into his calculations. All he cares about is protecting them. And so that caring attitude, that loving attitude, drives him to make the sacrifice play. And so when I read this passage about, do everything without grumbling or arguing so that you may become blameless and pure, I'm thinking of getting away from the bad attitude that is self-focused and instead receiving an attitude after God's heart of loving others that leads us to being sacrificial and having that sacrificial love for others that is a pure and blameless life, a life lived for the sake of other people. So if we want to have a blameless and pure life, not only do we, avoid the grumbling and arguing, but also we take the active step of having that love for other people that leads to a sacrificial life, which is a pure and blameless life. So that's the first part of this verse. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. And then we get to a then part here. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. Who's the them that is being referenced here? The them is the rest of the world. You will shine among the rest of the world like stars in the sky. And this is another benefit that we can be blessed with, that we can gain when we take on a godly attitude, is that it affects our witness in our world. Because when we have that godly attitude, again, we are filled with love for others, and we are also filled with a joy that goes beyond any circumstances. And that's something that the rest of the world doesn't have. The rest of the world is focused on themselves, and a lot of the times they're depressed, they're downhearted, they're anxious about the things going on around them. You don't find a whole lot of love for others and joy in our world today. If you doubt that, just scroll social media and tell me if you're seeing love and joy. Or if you're seeing grumbling and arguing and accusations and a lot of depressing thoughts, right? So when we have that godly attitude, we're filled with that love and joy. It is completely different from the rest of the world, which makes us stand out in the world like stars, bright, shining stars in a dark sky. And that can come through either in our love or in our joy or both. I've talked many times about my grandpa who was a pastor. And if anyone ever met him, whenever anyone met him, there was always something about him that would stick out in their minds. And it was that whenever you were sitting down and having a conversation with him, or even if it was just a family gathering and everybody's going around doing stuff and talking and you just have a moment with him, you're talking with him, you always felt like he was 100% completely present in that conversation. He was totally focused on whatever you were saying, as if nothing else mattered. And the love that people would feel, and he treated everyone that way, no matter who he was talking to, he was entirely focused on them. And so anytime you talked with him, you felt that undivided attention, and there would just be a wave of love that would wash over you. And that's something that I've always tried to be better at in my life, is that when I am talking to someone, that I'm not being distracted by what I have to do next, or all of the many things I have to get done that day, or whoever just texted me, or anything like that. To instead of being distracted by anything and everything else, to give that person my full undivided attention. And it's really not easy to do, especially in our culture and in the world that we live in today. But that makes it all the much more meaningful and impactful to someone's life when we show them that level of love. It stands out from the rest of the world, making us shine like stars in the sky. So that's the love side of it. What about the joy side? Well, the joy side is something that I think many churches are missing. And I think that's part of the reason why a lot of people have stopped going to church, is because they don't see any joy in the people that are there. There's no joy that is portrayed in their hearts, in their words, in their eyes. It's all just going along one week at a time, going through the motions. But that can be found anywhere you go. You see that when you go to work, the people you work with, just going along through the motions one day at a time. Even if you go out and enjoy the nightlife of the city, a lot of the times you're still just finding people that are just going along with the motions one day at a time. And very rarely do you find people not just caught up in hype and emotions and excitement, but people that are genuinely joyful and happy to live their lives. And boy, people in the church have so many reasons to be joyful. You think of the wonderful blessings we've received from Jesus. That should be the place where people find joy. And yet you go into church and you have even a time set apart for singing. What a joyful thing to sing and lift up God's name in music. But it doesn't even sound joyful most of the time. You come in and you can sing a beautiful hymn about the close relationship we have with Jesus. And the people singing it, it sounds like a funeral. They're in there and they're singing, And I joke all the time about this song because the words of this song are so happy, but it's always sung without any joy at all. It's What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and you hear people singing it a lot of the time. Excuse my terrible singing voice, but it sounds like when you hear people in church singing it, devoid of joy, it often sounds like this. What a friend we have in Jesus. All my sins and griefs to bear. And you're like, man, these people sound dead. these and the words of that song are, so uplifting. What a friend we have in Jesus. All my sins and griefs to bear. But people sing it like they're singing at a funeral. And we wonder why people don't enjoy going to church. It's because a lot of the times there's no joy to be found there. But the sad thing is there's no joy to be found anywhere else in the world. Not true, lasting joy that can face any circumstances. And we need to change that. We need to bring joy into our lives again. We need to let God fill our lives with His joy that comes from getting away from this selfish attitude of complaining and grumbling and arguing. Get away from that and let God fill us with joy so that when people encounter us or they come to church or whatever, that they're experiencing that joy that they can't experience anywhere else in the world. And what an impact that can have just being in that presence, that joyful presence. What an impact that can have on people's souls. You see, when we do have a godly attitude, we're filled with God's love and His joy. It affects our witness. And we need to be aware of how we portray ourselves to the world. And it's not just putting on a mask for the world. It's not pretending that everything's okay when it's not really okay. But rather letting God fill our hearts with love and joy that can't be found anywhere else but in Jesus. So that when we go out into the world, that we are shining that light like stars. And people see that love and joy and they realize that that's the place to fill that hole in their heart. So it's not just having a godly attitude for our own sake. It's also having an attitude, a godly attitude, for the sake of those who don't have a relationship with God. That's why it's so important. Now there's one more part at this passage, the very last part. It says, "Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky." And the first part of verse 16 says, "As you hold firmly to the word of life." So again, do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. You see, this here is the key for building that godly attitude in our heart, is that it comes by holding firmly to the word of life. What is that word of life? It's the gospel message. That message that there's more beyond this life. There's more beyond this world. There is an eternity in heaven with Jesus that is waiting for us. And you see, as we keep that in mind, as we keep that word of life, that message of life, that knowledge and understanding of the eternal life that is waiting for us beyond this world, Having that perspective reminds us that our worldly life is not about us. It's not about us. And boy, what a greater way to get rid of complaining and arguing and grumbling than to realize that the world doesn't revolve around you, but rather you should be more concerned with those who don't know Jesus. Audrey and I were reading through a passage in Luke the other day, and when I was thinking about this, about how our worldly life isn't about us, and we need to just kind of get over it and realize there's more to it than just, what we want and our desires and what makes us happy and everything being catered to us. I was thinking of this passage. It's in Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 20. It says, Jesus told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Isn't that a sobering thought? This man was so concerned with giving himself a comfortable life that he had more food than he could store, so he tore down his barns and built even bigger barns to store the food so that he could just sit back and relax and coast through the rest of his life. And God said, you have no idea. You're not going to be able to enjoy any of it because your life here on this world ends tonight. What a sobering thought that is. You see, every day we have on this earth, every breath we take is a gift from God, and we don't know which will be our last breath. We have no idea. So why chase after things in this world that make us happy? Why build our whole life around making ourselves comfortable when it could end at any moment and is inconsequential when compared to the eternal life after this one? Now, I'm not talking about, getting rid of the value of rest and ignoring the Sabbath or anything like that. But so many of us spend our whole lives seeking comfort, seeking whatever makes us happy. And that's what makes it easy to have a bad attitude a lot of the times, because when something doesn't make us happy, we feel robbed of what we were searching for. And so we complain about it, and why couldn't it be this way, or why couldn't this have happened instead? And then we start arguing with people, you should have done this differently, you should have done that better. It's all driven from that selfish desire for comfort and pleasure, which I've talked about a little bit in a sermon before. And it's just not worth it. It has no meaning. But many people, I think, fall into that mindset, fall into that attitude, because they don't know of any greater meaning in life. They don't have any greater purpose. The only purpose they have is to seek happiness. And so that's what they dedicate their whole life to. And it's because they don't have that relationship with God. Because when you do have that relationship with God, you have a purpose, you have a goal in life, and it's to spread the gospel message everywhere you go. And when you have that purpose that drives you, then comfort and pleasure seems inconsequential. Take my life, for example. I am naturally a homebody. I could spend an entire month indoors, and then basically did during the quarantine last year, and enjoy every second of it. I love being at home. I love just relaxing, just one day at a time, day in, day out, not going anywhere, not doing anything in particular, just relaxing at home. I could do that for probably months and years without getting tired of it. But there was a couple different times, a couple years, where I went on a missions trip to Mexico. And there's a little orphanage there. And it is so incredible because when I was there at the orphanage in Mexico, I wouldn't feel a desire to sit and relax because there is always so much work to be done there. There's work to be done. There was, things to do, people to talk to. And so while I was there, it wasn't even just that I didn't have a desire to relax. It was that I had this new purpose of wanting to make the most of my time there. And because of that, I couldn't even stand to relax most of the time. Although I did enjoy the everyday afternoon siestas that we got of taking a nap after a morning of work. That I did enjoy. But beyond that, even with that, it was like I'm resting because I'm physically exhausted from, mixing cement by hand early in the morning, so I'm physically exhausted. But even then, it was just I want to rest, not just so I can enjoy the resting, but so that I can get the energy that I need to go and do the rest of the work in the afternoon and evening. So the resting part, the comfort part, didn't become the end goal. It became the means for acquiring the end goal, for pursuing that mission. And that's the perspective that we should have in our world. That comforts, pleasures, downtime, relaxed time, that's not the end goal, but simply a means to fill us back up so that we can go and do what God has called us to do. You see, we have to let a godly purpose fill us with a godly attitude so that we can set this whole process in motion. What a wonderful goal to chase after. A godly attitude. And we receive that godly attitude through Scripture, through the Word of life that affects both our lives and the lives of others. Taking away that selfishness and replacing it with sacrificial love and unconditional joy that only comes from the Word of God. So I pray that as you go throughout your day and your week, that you would receive that attitude from God, that you would make your heart, your desires match the heart and desires of God, so that you can have a pure and blameless life, shining like stars in the sky in our world, as we hold tightly to the word of truth. If you have any questions or comments about anything I've talked about, you can always contact me through the Sermon in the Pocket Facebook page or email me at sermoninthepocket@gmail.com. And if you want to support the program financially, you can do so through Patreon. But I'd like many of you to support me simply by sharing this with family and friends or on any of your social media to just get the message out there. And again, thank you for taking the time to listen. And I pray that God will bless you as you go throughout your day.